March 10, 1968, 5,800 feet above sea level, perched on a remote mountaintop in Laos, a place that officially didn't exist, a base that had no name on any map, a mission the United States government would deny for 3 decades. Chief Master Sergeant Richard Etchberger sat at his radar console, watching green phosphor traces sweep across the screen. The equipment around him was worth millions of dollars, some of the most advanced targeting technology in the world. But right now it was picking up something that made his blood run cold. Movement. Lots of it. On the slopes below, Etchberger wasn't a combat soldier. He was a radar technician, an electronics specialist from Hamburg, Pennsylvania, who had joined the Air Force to work with cutting-edge equipment, not to fight battles. None of the men on this mountaintop were infantry. They were technicians, analysts, and specialists. Their weapons were radars and computers, not rifles, but the North Vietnamese, army soldiers climbing toward them through the darkness. Approximately 5,000 of them. Didn't care about that. Distinction. Welcome to Lima Site 85, the PEHU, most classified base of the Vietnam War, a place so secret that when it was overrun, the United States government claimed it never existed. A facility so important that its radar guided more bombing missions into North Vietnam than any other installation in the war. And it was defended by 11 Air Force technicians who had signed up to operate equipment, not to become the last line of defense on an impossible mountaintop in a country where America wasn't supposed to be fighting. This is the story of how radar operators became warriors, how a secret so important it couldn't be acknowledged led to men being abandoned on a mountain, how technicians armed with rifles held off an army, and how the United States government buried the truth for 30 years to protect a mission that should never have been revealed. The story begins not on that mountaintop in Laos, but in the skies over North Vietnam, where American aircraft were dying at an alarming rate. By late 1965, Operation Rolling Thunder, the sustained bombing campaign against North Vietnam, was facing a critical problem. American pilots were trying to hit targets in one of the most heavily defended airspaces in the world, and they were doing it with navigation and targeting systems designed for a different kind of war. The numbers were sobering. In 1965 and 1966, the United States lost hundreds of aircraft over North Vietnam. Pilots were being shot down, captured, or killed at rates that shocked military planners. Each downed aircraft represented not just millions of dollars in lost equipment, but the loss or capture of highly trained pilots who took years to replace. Part of the problem was geography. Most American air bases were in South Vietnam or Thailand, hundreds of miles from targets in North Vietnam. Pilots had to navigate over mountainous jungle terrain, often in bad weather, trying to locate targets and return safely. But the bigger problem was the radar. American bombing relied heavily on radar-guided navigation systems. Ground-based radar installations would track aircraft, help them navigate to targets, and guide bombing runs. The system worked well when the radar sites were close enough to the targets, but the best radar coverage of North Vietnam came from sites in South Vietnam and Thailand, which were too far away. The curvature of the Earth, combined with North Vietnam's mountainous terrain, created radar shadows, areas where ground-based radar couldn't see. Pilots flying missions into the most heavily defended areas around Hanoi and Haiphong were essentially navigating blind for critical portions of their missions. They had to rely on dead reckoning navigation, visual landmarks that were often obscured by weather, and their own skills. The result was reduced accuracy, longer exposure to enemy defenses, and higher losses. The Air Force needed a solution. They needed a radar site closer to North Vietnam, much closer, close enough to provide continuous radar coverage of the most important target areas. But there was a problem. Politics, the Geneva Accords of 1962, had established Laos as a neutral country in the Vietnam conflict. The United States had agreed not to introduce military forces into Laos. Officially, there were no American combat troops in Laos. Unofficially, Laos was anything but neutral. The North Vietnamese were running supplies and troops down the Ho Chi Minh Trail through eastern Laos. The CIA was conducting covert operations throughout the country. The secret war in Laos was one of the worst-kept secrets in Southeast Asia. But officially, maintaining the fiction of Laotian neutrality was important for diplomatic reasons. The United States couldn't openly establish a military base in Laos, so they did it secretly. In 1966, Air Force intelligence identified a location that was almost perfect for a radar installation. Pho Pha Thi, a 5,800-foot limestone karst mountain in northeastern Laos, near the border with North Vietnam. The mountain was a natural fortress. Its summit was a relatively flat plateau about 160 feet across. The sides were nearly vertical limestone cliffs, in some places completely vertical, making conventional assault extremely difficult. More importantly, its height and location provided line-of-sight radar coverage of critical areas in North Vietnam, including the approaches to Hanoi. A radar installation on Pho Phi Thi could guide bombing missions with unprecedented accuracy. There was just one problem: building and operating a sophisticated radar installation on top of an isolated mountain in a supposedly neutral country, keeping it secret from the world, and defending it from enemy forces. The project was assigned to the CIA and the Air Force, operating under the cover name Heavy Green. The installation itself would be designated Lima Site 85, one of hundreds of covert sites throughout Laos that were identified only by numbers. Lima Site 85 would officially not exist. The men who operated it would officially not be there. If anything went wrong, the United States government would deny everything. Construction began in late 1966. CIA contracted Air America helicopters flew in equipment and supplies. Hmong tribesmen, allied with the CIA, provided local security. The limestone summit was blasted and leveled to create platforms for the radar equipment. By late 1967, Lima Site 85 was operational. The installation featured a TSQ-81 tactical radar system, one of the most advanced pieces of electronic warfare equipment in the world. The system could track aircraft, guide bombing missions, and provide navigation assistance with extraordinary precision. The radar operators were Air Force personnel, but they weren't officially in the Air Force while stationed at Lima Site 85. Their military records showed them on temporary duty at various locations far from Laos. They wore civilian clothes. They carried false identification. If captured, they would have no proof they were American military personnel. They were effectively ghosts, men who officially weren't where they were, doing work that officially wasn't happening. The technology they operated was revolutionary. The TSQ-81 system could guide multiple bombing missions simultaneously, providing course corrections and targeting data to aircraft up to 200 miles away. Pilots approaching targets in North Vietnam could receive real-time navigation updates, corrections for wind and weather, and precise bomb release coordinates. The impact was immediate and dramatic. Bombing accuracy improved significantly. Pilots could fly in weather conditions that would have previously made missions impossible. Target areas that had been difficult to hit were now being struck with precision. Between November 1967 and March 1968, Lima Site 85 guided over 20,000 bombing missions into North Vietnam. It became the single most important radar installation in the war, directing more strikes than any other facility, and the North Vietnamese knew it. North Vietnamese air defense commanders noticed the change immediately. American bombing accuracy had improved dramatically. Aircraft that should have been lost in bad weather were finding their targets. The bombing patterns indicated the presence of a sophisticated guidance system much closer than any known American installation. North Vietnamese intelligence began searching for the source. They monitored radio transmissions. They tracked aircraft flight patterns. They studied bombing missions to determine where guidance was originating. By January 1968, they had located Lima Site 85. The mountain fortress that the Americans thought was secret had been discovered, and the North Vietnamese began planning an assault that would eliminate the most important American radar installation in Southeast Asia. The men stationed at Lima Site 85 were an unusual group. They weren't infantry. They weren't special operations. They were Air Force electronics specialists and technicians, men who had joined the military to work with advanced technology, not to fight ground battles. Chief Master Sergeant Richard Etchberger was the senior enlisted man on the mountain. At 35 years old, he was older than most of the others, a career Air Force NCO with a wife and 3 sons back in Pennsylvania. Etchberger was a radar specialist, one of the most skilled technicians in the Air Force. He could troubleshoot complex electronic systems, interpret radar returns, and guide bombing missions with exceptional precision. He was also, by all accounts, a deeply decent man. Fellow airmen described him as patient, professional, and protective of the younger technicians under his supervision. He took his responsibilities seriously, not just to the mission, but to the men. Technical Sergeant James Davis was another veteran radar operator. From California, Davis was known for his calm demeanor under pressure, operating sophisticated radar equipment while guiding multiple bombing missions simultaneously required focus and precision. Davis had both. The other technicians ranged in age from early 20s to mid-30s. Most were married. Several had children. They had joined the Air Force for career opportunities, education benefits, and the chance to work with cutting-edge technology. None of them had signed up to defend a mountaintop against an enemy army. Life at Lima Site 85 was strange. The men lived in a small compound on the summit, concrete buildings housing the radar equipment, operations center, and living quarters. The facilities were Spartan but functional. Supplies arrived by helicopter. Communications with the outside world were limited and monitored. They worked 12-hour shifts, operating the radar systems that guided bombing missions around the clock. The work was technically demanding, but not physically dangerous. At least, it hadn't been. Security was provided by Hmong tribesmen, led by CIA advisors. The Hmong were fierce fighters with intimate knowledge of the local terrain. They maintained positions on the approaches to the summit and conducted patrols in the surrounding area. But the Hmong security force numbered only a few hundred men, scattered across multiple defensive positions. They were lightly armed, rifles, machine guns, mortars, enough to defend against small-scale probes and harassment attacks. Not enough to stop a determined assault by thousands of regular North Vietnamese army troops. The technicians at Lima Site 85 were armed, but minimally. Each man had an M16 rifle and a basic load of ammunition. They had received basic combat training, the standard weapons familiarization that all Air Force personnel went through. But they weren't infantry. They hadn't trained for sustained ground combat. They were technicians who happened to have rifles. By early 1968, intelligence reports indicated increased North Vietnamese activity in the area. Enemy units were moving into the region. Radio intercepts suggested the North Vietnamese knew about Lima Site 85 and were planning something. The CIA advisors requested reinforcements. The Air Force wanted to evacuate the radar technicians and shut down the facility. But Washington hesitated. Lima Site 85 was too important. The bombing campaign relied on the precision guidance it provided. Shutting it down would significantly reduce American bombing effectiveness. The decision was made to reinforce the Hmong security forces and continue operations. The radar technicians were told the situation was under control. The mountain was secure. They should continue their mission. It was a decision that would haunt the survivors for the rest of their lives. On January 12, 1968, North Vietnamese forces conducted their first direct assault on Lima Site 85. Not from the ground, but from the air. 2 Soviet-built An-2 Colt biplanes, antiquated aircraft used primarily for crop dusting and light cargo transport, approached the mountain at dawn. They were flying low and slow, beneath radar coverage, each carrying a payload of 120 mortar rounds, rigged as improvised bombs. The attack was crude, but effective. The slow-moving biplanes were difficult targets for air defense systems designed to intercept fast jets. They approached the summit, dropped their bomb loads, and turned away. The explosions damaged several buildings and destroyed some of the external equipment. 1 Hmong guard was killed. Several others were wounded. More importantly, the attack proved that Lima Site 85 was vulnerable. The North Vietnamese had found the secret base and were willing to attack it directly. The technicians, shaken by the attack, asked about evacuation. They were radar operators, not combat troops. If the base was under direct attack, shouldn't they be pulled out? The answer from higher command was firm. Continue operations. The mission is too important. Reinforcements are coming. The base will be secured. But the reinforcements didn't come. Not in sufficient numbers. Not with sufficient equipment. The diplomatic fiction of Laotian neutrality meant that American combat forces couldn't openly defend Lima Site 85. The defense remained in the hands of Hmong tribesmen and CIA advisors. Throughout February, intelligence reports painted an increasingly grim picture. North Vietnamese units were massing in the region. Not small units or guerrilla forces, but regular NVA battalions, thousands of troops, heavily armed, with artillery support. They were preparing for a ground assault on the mountain. The technicians continued their work, 12-hour shifts operating the radar systems, guiding bombing missions, tracking aircraft, providing navigation data, doing the job they had been sent to do. But now they also stood watch with their rifles. They reinforced defensive positions. They planned escape routes. They discussed what they would do if the base was overrun. Chief Master Sergeant Etchberger reassured the younger technicians. Help would come if needed. The Air Force wouldn't abandon them. The mountain's geography made it extremely difficult to assault. The Hmong defenders were skilled fighters. But privately, Etchberger had doubts. He had seen the intelligence reports. He understood the numbers. And he knew that if thousands of NVA troops attacked, the small force defending Lima Site 85 would be overwhelmed. On March 9, 1968, the Hmong security forces reported heavy enemy contact on the lower slopes of the mountain. North Vietnamese troops were probing the defenses, testing response times, identifying weak points. It was the final preparation before the main assault. That night, the radar technicians worked their shifts as usual. The bombing missions continued. Aircraft over North Vietnam received their guidance from the mountaintop installation that officially didn't exist. In the darkness below, approximately 5,000 North Vietnamese Army troops began climbing the mountain. The North Vietnamese plan was methodically brutal. They had studied the mountain for months, identifying every approach, every defensive position, every vulnerable point. They had amassed a force large enough to overwhelm the defenders through sheer numbers. The assault began in the early morning hours of March 10, 1968, under cover of darkness. North Vietnamese sappers, elite combat engineers, led the way. These specialists were trained in infiltration and demolition. They climbed the steep limestone slopes silently, avoiding Hmong defensive positions, cutting through obstacles, marking paths for the infantry following behind. The first indication of attack came around 2:30 a.m. when Hamong sentries on the lower slopes reported contact with enemy forces. But these weren't probing attacks or harassment. This was a coordinated assault by multiple battalions moving up different approaches simultaneously. The Hamong defenders fought desperately, but they were outnumbered more than 10 to 1. North Vietnamese troops used the darkness and terrain to infiltrate past defensive positions. When the Hmong tried to fall back to secondary positions, they found NVA troops already there, having climbed alternative routes. By 3:00 a.m., the situation was critical. North Vietnamese forces had breached the outer defensive perimeter and were advancing up the mountain in overwhelming numbers. Hmong casualties were mounting. Several CIA advisors were wounded. Radio communications were chaotic. At the summit compound, the radar technicians could hear the fighting below. The sound of automatic weapons fire echoed off the limestone cliffs. Explosions from grenades and mortars reverberated through the mountain. Radio chatter between Hmong units painted a grim picture. The defenses were collapsing. Chief Master Sergeant Etchberger made the decision to continue radar operations. American aircraft were in the air over North Vietnam, relying on guidance from Lima Site 85. Those pilots needed the support. The mission continued even as enemy forces climbed toward the summit. It was a decision that demonstrated extraordinary dedication and the terrible isolation of the men on that mountain. They knew they were under attack by a force large enough to overrun the base. They knew help might not arrive in time, but they continued guiding bombing missions because American pilots were depending on them. By 4:00 a.m., North Vietnamese troops had reached the summit plateau. The Hmong defensive line had been shattered. Most of the Hmong fighters were dead, wounded, or retreating down alternative escape routes. The CIA advisors, realizing the position was lost, had begun evacuating by helicopter from a small landing zone on the summit. The 11 Air Force technicians were ordered to the landing zone for evacuation. They shut down the radar systems, destroyed classified materials, and grabbed their weapons. This is where training and instinct diverged from reality. The technicians had practiced evacuation procedures. They knew where the landing zone was located. They had designated rally points, but none of the practice had prepared them for the reality of evacuating under fire while enemy troops were literally climbing onto the summit plateau. The landing zone was a small cleared area on the eastern side of the summit, barely large enough for a helicopter to land. Getting to it required crossing open ground that was now exposed to enemy fire. North Vietnamese troops reaching the summit focused their assault on the operations compound, not realizing at first that the Americans were attempting to evacuate. This brief confusion gave the technicians a narrow window to reach the landing zone. But the window was closing rapidly. Chief Master Sergeant Etchberger took charge of the evacuation. He organized the technicians into groups, assigned rally points, and established a basic defensive perimeter around the landing zone. These radar operators, who had spent their careers working with electronic equipment, were now setting up defensive positions and preparing to fight off an enemy assault with their rifles. The first helicopter attempting to land at the evacuation point took heavy fire and was forced to pull away. The pilot reported that the landing zone was too hot, too much enemy. Fire to safely land. The technicians were trapped on the summit with North Vietnamese troops advancing from multiple directions. This is where Richard Etchberger transformed from radar technician to combat leader. He positioned the technicians in a defensive perimeter, assigned fields of fire, and took the most exposed position himself. As North Vietnamese soldiers reached the landing zone area, Etchberger engaged them with his M16 rifle. The other technicians, following his example, began returning fire. These men, electronics specialists who had spent months operating radar consoles, were now in direct combat with North Vietnamese regular army troops. The firefight was chaotic and desperate. The technicians had minimal combat training and limited ammunition, but they had good positions among the rocks at the landing zone, and they had motivation, the absolute knowledge that capture or death were the only alternatives to holding until evacuation arrived. Technical Sergeant James Davis took a position near Etchberger, providing covering fire while the Chief Master Sergeant coordinated the defense. Other technicians spread out among the rocks, firing at North Vietnamese soldiers who were attempting to flank the position. Etchberger's leadership in those critical minutes was extraordinary. He directed fire, called out targets, repositioned defenders as needed, and maintained communication with the evacuation helicopters trying to reach them. He was also, incredibly, providing first aid to wounded technicians while simultaneously engaging enemy forces. One of the younger airmen was hit by enemy fire and went down. Etchberger left his position, crossed open ground under fire, reached the wounded man, and dragged him back to cover. He applied a pressure dressing while continuing to direct the defense. Then he returned to his exposed position and resumed fighting. It was the kind of leadership, calm, professional, selfless, that inspires men to do things they didn't think they were capable of. Around 5:30 a.m., as dawn began breaking over the mountain, an Air Force HH-3E Jolly Green Giant rescue helicopter made another attempt to reach the landing zone. The pilot, flying through intense ground fire, managed to hover over the zone while his crew chief prepared to take on survivors. Etchberger organized the evacuation with the same calm efficiency he had brought to radar operations. He directed wounded men to the helicopter first. He counted heads to ensure no one was left behind. He provided covering fire while technicians ran to the hovering aircraft. The helicopter couldn't fully land. The terrain was too rough and the fire too intense. It hovered a few feet off the ground while survivors scrambled aboard. 3 technicians made it to the helicopter, then 4, then 5. Etchberger remained at his defensive position, firing at approaching North Vietnamese soldiers, buying time for his men to evacuate. When most of the survivors were aboard, Etchberger finally ran for the helicopter. He reached it, grabbed the crew chief's extended hand, and was pulled toward the cargo door. That's when he was hit. A North Vietnamese soldier, firing from a position near the summit, shot Etchberger as he was being pulled into the helicopter. The bullet struck him in the side, a catastrophic wound. The helicopter crew pulled him aboard anyway. The pilot, seeing that all survivors who could be reached were now on the aircraft, pulled away from the mountain. Inside the helicopter, the surviving technicians and the Air Force pararescue jumpers worked frantically on Etchberger. The wound was severe, internal bleeding, likely damage to major organs. He needed immediate surgical intervention, but they were flying over mountainous jungle terrain in Laos. The nearest medical facility with surgical capability was in Udorn, Thailand, approximately 45 minutes away by helicopter. Etchberger remained conscious initially. According to survivors, he asked about the other men. Did everyone get out? Did we get them all? The pararescuemen tried to reassure him while working to stop the bleeding. But the wound was beyond field treatment. Etchberger needed a trauma surgeon and a fully equipped operating room. He had neither. Chief Master Sergeant Richard Etchberger died in the helicopter before it reached medical facilities. He was 35 years old. He left behind a wife, Kathy, and 3 sons, Steve, 13, Corey, 10, and Richard Jr., 6. The helicopter carrying the survivors landed at Udorn Air Base in Thailand. Of the 11 Air Force technicians who had been at Lima Site 85, 4 had made it out alive. 7 were missing, presumed killed in the assault or captured. The survivors were immediately placed in isolation. They were debriefed by intelligence officers. They were told that their experience at Lima Site 85 was classified. They could not discuss what had happened. They could not reveal where they had been. They could not talk about how their fellow airmen had died. Officially, Lima Site 85 didn't exist. Officially, there were no American military personnel in Laos. Officially, the 11 technicians who had been on that mountain hadn't been there at all. The surviving technicians were told that for national security reasons, the truth about Lima Site 85 had to remain secret. They were forbidden from attending funerals for their fallen comrades. They couldn't contact the families to explain what had happened. They couldn't share the truth about the battle they had survived. The official explanation given to families was vague and bureaucratic. The airmen had died in a classified operation in Southeast Asia. No further details could be provided. No, there would be no remains returned for burial. No, the families couldn't know the circumstances of death. Kathy Etchberger was told her husband had died in a helicopter crash in Vietnam. The Air Force couldn't tell her the truth. She didn't learn the full story of how Richard died for over 20 years. The fall of Lima Site 85 was a disaster, not just in terms of lives lost, but in terms of mission capability. The installation had been guiding over 20,000 bombing missions. Its radar coverage of North Vietnam was irreplaceable. Without Lima Site 85, American bombing accuracy decreased significantly. Pilots lost the precision guidance that had made missions more effective and safer. The Air Force scrambled to find alternative radar solutions, but nothing matched the coverage that the mountaintop installation had provided. But acknowledging the loss would mean acknowledging that Lima Site 85 had existed. And that would mean admitting that the United States had established a military installation in officially neutral Laos, in direct violation of international agreements. So the United States government made a decision: deny everything. Lima Site 85 officially never existed. The installation that had guided 20,000-plus bombing missions was erased from official records. The 11 Air Force technicians who had been stationed there were never officially in Laos. 13. Cover-up was comprehensive and systematic. Military records were altered to show the technicians on temporary duty at various locations far from Laos. Personnel files were classified. After-action reports were buried under layers of secrecy. Families were told their loved ones had died in a helicopter crash, with no further details available. The surviving technicians were forbidden from speaking about their experience. They signed non-disclosure agreements. They were warned that revealing classified information could result in prosecution. They carried the burden of their experience in silence. For the families of the 7 men killed at Lima Site 85, the silence was agonizing. They had lost husbands, fathers, brothers, and they weren't allowed to know how or why. The military couldn't honor the men's sacrifice because acknowledging the sacrifice would reveal the secret mission. The Geneva Accords fiction was maintained. Laos remained officially neutral. The United States continued to deny having military installations or conducting combat operations in the country. Meanwhile, the secret war in Laos continued to escalate. The Ho Chi Minh Trail remained a critical supply route for North Vietnamese forces. American and Allied forces continued covert operations throughout the country. But Lima Site 85 was gone, and with it, the most effective radar installation of the Vietnam War. North Vietnamese forces occupied the summit of Pho Pha Thi after the battle. They destroyed the remaining American equipment, removing any evidence of the installation. The sophisticated radar systems were demolished. Buildings were torn down. The summit was left as a bare limestone plateau. Within weeks, it was as if the installation had never existed. For the survivors, the psychological burden was immense. They had experienced combat that they couldn't discuss. They had lost friends whose deaths they couldn't properly mourn. They carried guilt about surviving when others hadn't. And they carried the knowledge that Richard Etchberger had saved their lives through his leadership and sacrifice. But they couldn't tell anyone about it. The military system that should have recognized heroism couldn't function when the Heroism itself was classified. Etchberger's actions at the landing zone, organizing the defense, providing covering fire, evacuating wounded men, staying behind to protect others, clearly met the criteria for high military honors. But acknowledging his heroism would require acknowledging where he was and what he was doing. And that couldn't be revealed. So Chief Master Sergeant Richard Etchberger received no recognition beyond a standard Air Force Commendation Medal, an award given for routine meritorious service. There was no mention of combat, no mention of heroism under fire, no mention of sacrificing his life to save others. The medal citation was generic and vague, providing no details that might reveal the truth about Lima Site 85. His family received the medal at a private ceremony. They were told it recognized his service in Southeast Asia. They weren't told how he died, where he died, or that his final actions had saved the lives of multiple men. The other families received similar treatment. Generic medals, vague citations, no details, no closure. The cover-up held for years. The men who survived Lima Site 85 carried their secret through the end of the Vietnam War, through their transitions to civilian life, through decades of trying to process an experience they couldn't share. Some struggled with the silence more than others. The inability to properly mourn, to honor fallen comrades, to tell the truth about what happened. It took a psychological toll that some never fully recovered from. But slowly, as years passed, and the Vietnam War faded from immediate headlines, the absolute necessity of secrecy began to diminish. The Cold War context that had made Laotian neutrality important changed. The political sensitivities that had required the cover-up became less acute. In the 1990s, some information about Lima Site 85 began to emerge. Journalists investigating the secret war in Laos discovered references to the installation. Veterans who had served in related operations started sharing information. The CIA began declassifying some documents related to operations in Laos. The full story started coming together in bits and pieces. The secret base, the radar missions, the assault, the deaths, the cover-up. In 1998, a team of investigators traveled to Laos to search the area around Pho Pha Thi for remains of the men killed in 1968. The mission was difficult. 30 years had passed. The jungle had reclaimed the mountain, and the local political situation made access challenging. But they found evidence: human remains, military equipment, artifacts that confirmed American presence on the mountain. DNA testing identified some of the remains as belonging to the men lost in March 1968. Finally, decades after their deaths, some of the Lima Site 85 technicians were coming home. The families, after 30 years of uncertainty, finally received definitive answers. And the truth about what happened on that mountain could finally be told.